So let's dig into the Jimmy Kimmel suspension. And look, this is way more than just another celebrity controversy. What we're really looking at here is a case study, a perfect storm where comedy, a real-life tragedy, and raw politics all smashed together. And it left us with some huge questions about where we as a country draw the line. And this quote right here from California's Governor Gavin Newsom really just throws you right into the middle of the conflict. They are censoring you in real time. I mean, it perfectly captures the two sides of this whole thing. So what was it? Was this a famous host finally being held accountable for his words, or was it something way more sinister? That one sentence, it basically set the stage for the entire national debate. Okay, so let's start with the spark that lit the whole fire. First, let's just cover the basics of what happened, because the news itself was a real shock. You have a host who's been on the air for over 20 years, a staple of late-night TV, and he's just pulled from the air, indefinitely. And, this wasn't some planned vacation. It was an abrupt, unprecedented stop that immediately made everyone sit up and pay attention. And this was the line that lit the fuse. In his monologue, Kimmel says, "The MAGA gang is desperately trying to characterize this kid who murdered Charlie Kirk as anything other than one of them." So you see, he didn't just accuse his political opponents of exploiting a tragedy. He explicitly labeled the shooter as being on their side, as one of them. Now, there was just one major problem with what Kimmel said. It was factually wrong. See, law enforcement had already reported that the shooter actually held extreme left-wing views. And that single, critical mistake, that's what turned this from a controversial joke into a full-blown crisis. It became the ammunition for everyone demanding he be fired. And the speed? I mean, the speed at which this whole thing collapsed was just breathtaking. Let's just walk through it. September 10th, the assassination happens. A few days later, on the 16th, Kimmel delivers that monologue. And then by the very next day, the 17th, it's chaos. You've got widespread online backlash, the FCC chairman is threatening action, and by the end of that day, ABC announces the suspension. We're talking from a monologue to being off the air in roughly 24 hours. Incredible. All right, next up, comedy's political battlefield. So why did this one comment from one comedian explode with such incredible force? Well, it's because it landed right in the middle of a political battlefield. This was never just about a bad joke. It was about the much bigger, much more complicated role that late-night comedy now plays in our public life. For a long time, late-night political jokes were pretty, toothless is a good word for it. They were safe, but that's really changed. Researchers who look at this stuff have noted that today's hosts have evolved far beyond that. They're not just trying to get a laugh anymore. They're actively trying to shape public discourse, to actually influence how people think. And it's not random. There's a clear strategy behind this, and it's all driven by data. Check this out. A 2018 study found this really direct link between negativity and how many people watch. The more biased and negative the attack on a political figure, the more engagement, the more views it gets. It's simple, really. In today's media world, outrage is currency. For the network, ABC, this was almost like history repeating itself. It's kind of a case of deja vu. I mean, just look back to 2002. They canceled Bill Maher's show, Politically Incorrect, for his really controversial comments about the 9/11 hijackers. So what do we have in both cases? A controversial host, a national tragedy, and a network making a really tough call. The parallels are they're striking. Okay, so let's get into the anatomy of this thing, the outrage machine. How did all of this anger and backlash mobilize so quickly? Well, it wasn't just random. Turns out researchers have a specific name for this kind of phenomenon, and it follows a very predictable pattern. It's called an online firestorm. And the academic definition is the sudden discharge of large quantities of negative word of mouth and complaint behavior and so on. But let's just focus on the key words there: sudden and large quantities. This isn't a slow burn of criticism over weeks or months. It is a sudden, massive explosion of outrage, all pointed at one single person or company. And these firestorms have very specific characteristics. And if you look at the list, the Kimmel case ticked every single box. It was super specific, right? Focused only on that one claim in his monologue. The hostility was off the charts. The reaction felt to many totally disproportionate to the offense. There was a high consensus. Everyone in the attacking group was saying the same thing, and it was volatile. It just exploded out of nowhere. And what's really fascinating is that this isn't a global one-size-fits-all thing. Research comparing online firestorms in the US versus China shows a really distinct American style. On US Twitter, firestorms are defined by mockery, loud opinion sharing, and very clear calls to action, like demanding someone be fired. And at targets, they're usually individuals in government and politics. So the whole campaign against Kimmel wasn't just a firestorm, it was a textbook American firestorm. And this brings us to the fallout. The big debate, censorship versus consequences. Because once ABC actually suspended the show, the conversation completely shifted. It wasn't really about Kimmel's joke anymore. It became about this massive, fundamental question. Was this just a company dealing with the consequences of an employee's words? Or was this actual government censorship in action? And this comment from the FCC chairman, Brendan Carr, just poured gasoline all over the fire. He said companies like ABC need to take action on Kimmel, or there's going to be additional work for the FCC ahead. Now remember, the FCC is the government body that licenses TV networks. So when its chairman says that, it's not really heard as a suggestion. To many people, that sounded like a direct threat. Then, the reaction from the highest level of government was, well, celebratory. President Trump called it great news for America and congratulated ABC for having the courage to do what had to be done. So when you put that together with the FCC's statement, it really solidified the argument for a lot of folks that this wasn't about consequences. It was about politically motivated pressure coming from the highest levels of government. But the counter-argument came just as swiftly and just as forcefully. Senator Ed Markey, for instance, came out swinging. He didn't pull any punches, calling the FCC the Federal Censorship Commission. He framed the whole thing as a clear, unconstitutional warning to every single media company out there. Basically, adopt our political line or we're coming after you. But what about outside of Washington? If you look at public forums, like on Reddit's Ask Conservatives, you see this argument a lot, that freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences. The idea here is that this isn't censorship at all. It's just consequences. The belief that free speech doesn't and shouldn't protect you from the social or economic fallout of what you say. However, it's really interesting because even within that same online community, there was a lot of division and deep concern. You also saw comments like this one, saying that Trump weaponizing the FCC is a massive problem. So this shows the other side of the coin, right? A fear that even if you think Kimmel was totally wrong, the government using a regulatory body like the FCC to influence a network, well, that's a huge problem that crosses a really critical line. And the reaction from groups that focus on civil liberties and free speech was pretty much unified and very alarmed. The Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, or FIR, said this was a clear example of a media outlet withered under government pressure. The Actors Union, SAG-AFTRA, said the suspension endangers everyone's freedoms. The consensus from them was clear. This was a dangerous precedent. So, this whole thing really boils down to one fundamental question, one that this incident forces all of us to confront. When political comedy meets real-world tragedy, where is the line? Where is that line between free speech and accountability? In our hyperpolarized world, how do we balance the absolute necessity of free expression with the very real demand for accountability? There's just no easy answer to that.